September 15th, 1940. The Prime Minister's official residence in Tokyo. The air is thick with cigarette smoke, much of it from Admiral Ishizuki Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet. He stubs out his third lucky strike of the meeting. The American tobacco, a small, sharp irony lost on no one present. The tension is unbearable. Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe, cutting through the usual respectful circumlocutions, asks the question directly. He looks at the admiral, the man who would have to lead any war against the West, and asks the one question that defines the entire Japanese empire's future. If we go to war with America, what are our chances? This is the central paradox. This is the man who would soon conceive the devastating, brilliant attack on Pearl Harbor. And this is the moment he is forced to answer a question he knows, better than any man alive, has only one terrible answer. The other military officials in the room lean in, awaiting the patriotic reassurance they expect. They would not get it. Yamamoto's response was not the bold reassurance the cabinet craved. It was a cold, mathematical prophecy that would haunt the Japanese empire until its dying day. "If I am told to fight, regardless of consequences," Yamamoto stated, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." The other military officials in the room shifted uncomfortably. This was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the architect of their naval strategy, essentially predicting Japan's defeat before a single shot was fired. What they failed to grasp was that Yamamoto was not speculating. He was calculating. He had personally walked through America's factories, studied its endless oil fields, and calculated its production capability down to the last rivet. The mathematics of destruction had been computed years earlier, in the lecture halls of Harvard, the steel mills of Pennsylvania, and the oil derricks of Texas. Yamamoto knew something his colleagues, blinded by ideology, refused to accept. Japan had already lost any war with America before it even began. To understand his prophecy, you must understand the man. He was born Ishizuki Takanoo in Nagaoka, the sixth son of an impoverished schoolteacher. His father was 56 at his birth, leading to the name Ishizuki, meaning 56. His family's poverty was crushing. They often survived on sweet potatoes, unable to even afford rice. This early hardship would later form the lens through which he viewed the shocking, casual abundance of America. His defining military experience was the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where he lost 2 fingers on his left hand while witnessing Japan's stunning victory over the Russian fleet. But where his colleagues saw proof that spiritual superiority could overcome any material disadvantage, Yamamoto saw something different. The Tsushima veteran understood a truth his contemporaries missed. Japan's victory was an exception, not a rule. Russia had been forced to project power across thousands of miles while fighting a revolution at home. Yamamoto knew with chilling certainty that America would face no such disadvantages. This analytical, realist mindset forged in poverty and battle set him apart. In 1919, Commander Yamamoto received the orders that would seal his tragic destiny: report to Harvard University for English language studies. He arrived in Cambridge carrying 2 swords, a figure of intense curiosity. But he was not there to improve his grammar. His official transcript, showing a mediocre C+ in English, obscured the real education taking place. This was a self-directed intelligence mission. While other students socialized, Yamamoto slept just 3 to 4 hours a night. His modest room in Brookline became a private war room, cluttered not with textbooks, but with maps of American oil fields, technical journals on steel production, and statistical abstracts of manufacturing. He was conducting an industrial autopsy of a future enemy, and in Harvard's Widener Library, he uncovered the first terrifying clue. It had nothing to do with ships or soldiers. It was about oil. He calculated that America produced 65% of the entire world's supply. Japan, by contrast, had to import nearly every single drop, most of it from America itself. Yamamoto realized the blood of modern warfare wasn't blood, it was petroleum, and America had oceans of it. But books were one thing, seeing was another. In the summer of 1920, Yamamoto hitchhiked 900 miles from Cambridge to Detroit to observe what Henry Ford called the liberation of the common man. He stood outside the massive Ford Highland Park plant and watched the shift change. The sight that greeted him was a cultural and industrial shock. 20,000 workers streamed out, and most of them headed to private automobiles. In Japan, even a high-ranking military officer rarely owned a car. Here, it was the standard for the common laborer. Claiming to be a visiting engineering student, Yamamoto toured the plant's interior. What he saw there confirmed his worst fears. He observed the revolutionary assembly line, a
a symphony of systematic, efficient motion. A new Model T rolled off the line every 45 seconds. The entire process from raw steel to finished automobile took only 93 minutes. He filled 3 notebooks during his week in Detroit. His calculations were terrifying. Ford alone employed more industrial workers than the entire Japanese Navy. The company's daily steel consumption exceeded Japan's weekly production. And this was just one company, in one city, in one industry. But Yamamoto recognized the true hidden threat. He saw past the Model Ts. He understood that these assembly lines producing cars could just as easily produce military trucks, tanks, and aircraft engines. The workers skilled in precision manufacturing could build weapons. The vast supply chains feeding Detroit could deliver ammunition to battlefields. America wasn't just building cars. It was perfecting the science of mass production. Yamamoto's most extensive unauthorized journey took him to what he called the fountains of power in the summer of 1921. He disappeared for 6 weeks, causing minor diplomatic concern when he missed several official functions. Traveling by freight train and on foot, he reached the Spindletop Field near Beaumont. He spent his days talking to roughnecks and engineers, sketching the massive Texaco refinery at Port Arthur in his notebook, a facility that processed 100,000 barrels daily. The scale was simply beyond Japanese comprehension. Single wells in Texas produced more oil in a day than Japan imported in a week. But it wasn't the production that delivered the final psychological blow. It was the waste. He traveled north to the newly discovered fields in Kilgore, where derricks sprouted like a steel forest. There, natural gas, considered a useless byproduct, was burned off in massive flares that lit the night sky for miles. Yamamoto, who came from a nation that meticulously conserved every single drop of imported fuel, watched in stunned silence. He calculated that Americans were burning off enough waste gas every day to power all of Tokyo for a month. This casual, almost contemptuous abundance, more than any military demonstration, convinced him of America's invincibility. "Oil is the blood of modern warfare," he wrote. "America has oceans of it. This single fact determines everything." In January 1926, Yamamoto returned to America, this time as Japan's naval attaché in Washington, D.C. Now with proper diplomatic status and a proper budget, his observations became more official. But his most valuable intelligence came not from shipyards, but from a card table. Every Friday night, Yamamoto hosted high-stakes poker games at his apartment, inviting American naval officers, diplomats, and intelligence officials. These were not mere social occasions. Captain Ellis Zacharias of U.S. Naval Intelligence, a regular participant, would later reveal in his memoir that these games were subtle intelligence operations. While bluffing over cards, both sides were conducting careful interrogations about naval doctrine and strategic thinking. Here, Yamamoto confirms something more terrifying than any production statistic: American psychology. He observed that Americans were aggressive risk-takers. Why? Because they had deep pockets. They could afford to lose a battle, even a campaign, and simply re-buying into the game. Japan, with its limited resources, could not afford a single major defeat. After winning a substantial pot one evening, Yamamoto made a comment that Zacharias never forgot. "In poker and war," the admiral said, "the player with the most chips can afford to wait for the right cards. Japan is playing with borrowed chips against the player who owns the bank." Yamamoto's industrial analysis also revealed a truth his colleagues, obsessed with their battleships, had completely missed. The age of the dreadnought was over. His American tours convinced him that the next war would be three-dimensional, determined not by surface guns, but by aviation.
While the Japanese Navy perfected its plans for a decisive surface engagement, Yamamoto was visiting the Glenn L. Martin Company in Ohio and the new Douglas Aircraft Company in California. There, he saw workers who had never seen an airplane before building complex aircraft in weeks, using automobile-style assembly techniques Japan couldn't dream of. At McCook Field in Dayton, the predecessor to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, he observed American aviation research. The facility had wind tunnels, engine test labs, and, most critically, more aeronautical engineers than existed in all of Japan. This was Yamamoto's true genius. He wasn't just a bean counter. He was a visionary. He correctly identified the next decisive weapon, and he had seen with his own eyes that America already possessed the production capacity to build thousands of them. Returning to Japan in March 1928, Yamamoto submitted a comprehensive 200-page report on American capabilities. It was not a naval assessment. It was a mathematical death warrant. His conclusions, built from years of direct observation, were stark. American manufacturing exceeded Japan's by a factor of 10 to 20 in every critical category. American oil production was 100 times Japan's consumption. American steel production was 12 times greater. His final analysis, supported by hundreds of pages of data, was that a prolonged war with America was not just difficult, it was unwinnable. And here the curse of the prophet begins. The audience, having seen the evidence with Yamamoto, now watches in frustration. The report, a document that should have ended any thought of war, was classified, filed, and largely ignored. The Navy Ministry cherry-picked sections about ship construction while dismissing the damning industrial analysis. The Army, planning its expansion into China, had no interest at all. Yamamoto's warnings, born from hard data and direct observation, did not make him a respected prophet. They made him an outcast. In the rigid, nationalistic military circles of 1930s Japan, his realism was seen as defeatism. Whispers began that he was too Americanized, contaminated by his time in the West. His personal habits, drinking coffee instead of tea, smoking American Lucky Strikes, reading American magazines, were all marked against him as proof of this foreign influence. His colleagues, particularly in the Army, preferred the comfortable illusion of Japanese spirit over Yamamoto's uncomfortable mathematics. They chose to believe in a mystical superiority that could overcome any material disadvantage, dismissing the man who had actually counted the factories and the oil wells. This was his tragedy. His patriotism, his desperate data-driven attempt to save his nation from a suicidal war, was twisted into treason. By 1939, Yamamoto's vocal opposition to the Tripartite Pact and war with America had made him a public target for assassination by ultranationalist army officers. The one man who was trying to save Japan from itself was now being hunted in its own capital. The threat to his life became so serious that Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who shared Yamamoto's dread of the war, was forced to act. On August 30th, 1939, in a profound and tragic irony, Yonai appointed Yamamoto as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. The appointment was explicitly made to save Yamamoto's life, as he would be safer from army assassins at sea than in Tokyo. The paradox was now complete. The one man in Japan who knew with mathematical certainty that the war was unwinnable was now given supreme command of the very force that would have to fight it. He was condemned to lead a war he knew was lost. As he wrote to a friend, "It is like being asked to perform surgery on a patient who insists on committing suicide. I can perhaps delay the agony, but I cannot prevent the death." So we arrive at the central paradox, the question at the heart of this story. If Admiral Yamamoto knew with mathematical certainty that Japan would lose, why did he personally plan the attack on Pearl Harbor? The answer is the supreme irony of his career. He was a man condemned to find a way to win an unwinnable war. His solution was not based on Japanese strength, but on his intimate knowledge of American weakness. From his years in America, Yamamoto knew the nation's weakness was not material, it was psychological. He saw people secure in their continental fortress, blinded by their own strength, and steeped in complacency. His plan, therefore, was a desperate gamble. It was not a plan for total victory. He knew that was impossible. It was a plan to force a negotiation. The goal was to strike a single, devastating blow so shocking that it would shatter American morale and convince them the cost of fighting would be too high. He had to land this knockout punch before the industrial colossus he had witnessed in Detroit and Pennsylvania could fully mobilize. He was confident his pilots could succeed tactically, but he knew, even as he planned, that it would almost certainly fail strategically. The real failure would come in the aftermath, when the sleeping enemy he had tried to warn his colleagues about, angered and outraged, turned its full industrial might to war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a stunning tactical success. 8 American battleships were damaged or sunk, 188 aircraft were destroyed, and 2,403 Americans were killed. Japanese losses were minimal. Across Japan, crowds celebrated in the streets, hailing the glorious victory. But aboard his flagship Nagato, Admiral Yamamoto received the reports in grim silence. While his staff broke out sake to celebrate,
He retired to his cabin. Hollywood would later invent the famous line about awakening a sleeping giant. His real documented words were far more precise and chilling. He told his staff, "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack." Yamamoto understood the real failure of the day had nothing to do with the American carriers which had escaped. The true disaster was diplomatic. He had insisted the attack follow a declaration of war, but Japanese embassy bungling in Washington had prevented this. The attack was now a sneak attack. He knew this would unite America in a rage that made a negotiated peace, his only desperate hope, impossible. Instead, he told his staff, "We have guaranteed our own destruction through dishonor."
Exactly as Admiral Yamamoto had predicted, Japan ran wild. For half a year, the combined fleet swept across the Pacific with stunning, terrifying efficiency. Singapore, the impregnable fortress, fell. The Philippines fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. By May 1942, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from the borders of India to the middle of the Pacific. But Yamamoto took no joy in these victories. He understood they were illusions, possible only because America's industrial might had not yet mobilized. While his nation celebrated, Yamamoto was in his cabin, charting American ship construction. The numbers he received were terrifying. In just the first 6 months of 1942, while still retooling, American shipyards had already launched 2 new aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, 23 destroyers, and 26 submarines. This was just the beginning. The 6-month clock was ticking down. "We are children who have stolen candy," he told his operations officer. "We celebrate while the adult prepares his punishment." The Battle of Midway began on June 4th, 1942. It was almost exactly 6 months to the day after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's prophecy was about to be fulfilled with chilling mathematical precision. The disaster unfolded with the inevitability he had long foreseen. In a single catastrophic day, 4 of Japan's elite aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were caught, bombed, and sunk. These were irreplaceable losses. Japan had neither the industrial capacity nor the time to replace them. Aboard his flagship Yamato, 300 miles behind the carrier force, Yamamoto received the devastating reports in total silence. When informed that all 4 carriers were lost, he simply nodded. Staff officers later reported he seemed almost relieved, as if a burden he had carried for years had finally arrived. The prophecy was complete. His 6 months were over. "The American giant is now fully awake," he told his staff. "From this moment, we fight only to delay the inevitable." After Midway, the industrial colossus Yamamoto had warned of didn't just awaken, it became a force of nature. The mathematics of destruction he'd calculated at Harvard were now being unleashed with a speed that defied even his most pessimistic predictions. The numbers are not just statistics, they are the fulfillment of his prophecy. By 1943, American factories were producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes. They produced 1 merchant ship every day and 1 new aircraft carrier every month. The Ford Willow Run plant, a facility that didn't even exist when Yamamoto had visited Detroit, was a mile-long assembly line that by itself was producing a new B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The very assembly lines he'd studied were now, as he feared, producing instruments of Japan's destruction. This was the industrial tsunami. In the 18 months following Midway, America would launch 17 new fleet carriers and 76 escort carriers. In that same period, Japan would launch a total of 6. The final statistics of the war vindicate every calculation Yamamoto ever made. Total aircraft produced, America, 300,000, Japan, 76,000. Total aircraft carriers, America, 141, Japan, 16. This was the mathematics he saw in the 1920s. This was the continental industrial machine he knew with fatal certainty would grind his nation to dust. The final tragic irony of Yamamoto's life was his death. On April 14, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted a precise itinerary of his upcoming inspection tour in the Solomon Islands. Operation Vengeance was approved at the highest levels. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters were dispatched from Guadalcanal, flying 435 miles at wave-top height to avoid detection, a feat of navigation and engineering in itself. His death was not random. It was a perfect, poetic embodiment of everything he had warned about. He was killed by mass production. The P-38 Lightnings were products of the very assembly line philosophy he had witnessed in Detroit. He was killed by superior resources.
Those planes were powered by advanced Allison engines, burning high-octane fuel that came from the limitless Texas refineries he'd sketched in his notebooks, and he was killed by superior technology. The P-38s found him at the exact minute and location predicted, guided by code-breaking intelligence that Japan couldn't match. The man who'd experienced America's manufacturing power firsthand was quite literally shot out of the sky by its products. His death wasn't just an assassination. It was the final, fatal period at the end of his own prophecy. Yamamoto's story transcends its historical moment. It is the timeless, fundamental tragedy of wishful thinking confronting mathematical reality. His years in America, studying oil in Harvard's libraries, observing the assembly lines in Detroit, and counting the derricks in Texas, had given him perfect, unwelcome foresight. He was, as his American poker partner later wrote, a prophet without honor in his own country. He was a man of rigorous, empirical evidence in a culture that had chosen to believe in mystical superiority over uncomfortable facts. His ultimate tragedy was not that he was wrong, but that he was absolutely right. He was the admiral condemned to lead a war he knew was lost before it began. He was the Cassandra forced to plan the very attack that would guarantee his own nation's doom. And he was the prophet whose dire 6-month prophecy was fulfilled with mathematical precision, vindicated only in the ashes of his nation's defeat.